There's been this debate or even controversy, I guess you could call it, for a while now with the Switch, basically since it came out. And I think the reason it's just been ongoing as long as it has is because there's really no clear-cut answer for which generation the Switch falls into. Seriously, this is something that is hotly debated online, and I kind of want to talk about it here today, mostly because I wanted to see what all of you thought. Guys, if you enjoy these videos, make sure that like button helps out a ton, and if you're new here to the Spawnwave Plus channel, make sure you subscribe down below. Let's head over here. This is just an easy way to visualize the different generations, right? Like this goes all the way back to the 70s with the Odyssey and Atari Pong and the Coleco Telstar series. So yeah, it's pretty in-depth here for this list. It is on Wikipedia, so I'm sure people will edit these lists at times. I mean, I'm sure the Switch itself maybe has moved around as it is. So I wouldn't take this absolute when it comes to making your decision on where the Switch falls in line. But either way, we have the first, the second generation. A lot of people, I would say now, are familiar with at least the third generation, the 8-bit generation with the Nintendo, the Master System, and the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Sega Master System, and then the Atari 7800. And then you go to the fourth generation. Most people are aware of the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis, less so with the TurboGrafx 16 or the Neo Geo. And I think for the most part, looking at those generations, everyone agrees that, yeah, that makes sense. In fact, you actually have to go down to the 6th generation to really find a system that actually has gone through this before, and it kind of still is now, and that's the Sega Dreamcast. Now, this isn't new, technically, where people are arguing about which generation a system fits into. The Dreamcast is an interesting one because it came out in '98 in Japan initially, so it came out like 2 years after the Nintendo 64, and it was basically gone, or just about gone, when the PlayStation 2 came out. Now, the PS2 hype certainly demolished the Dreamcast, but still, the Dreamcast didn't really sit alongside of the PS2, the GameCube, or the Xbox much at all, but it's still considered in that generation. And I think it has to do with the visuals and the technology inside of it. It was less comparable to something like the Nintendo 64 or the PlayStation, but if you look at the 64, it was a 64-bit system versus the 32-bit system. So that was like twice as many bits. We were still in like the bit wars at that time, which was funny because I feel like we were mostly over it after the 16-bit era, but a lot of companies really tried to push that into the 5th generation. Obviously, by the 6th generation, we were over it because we're like 128 bits. Like, what are we doing here, right? But the Dreamcast, you could make the case that it was actually part of the 5th generation, and it was the most powerful system there. I mean, the technology, you still had CDs, which basically the same as the PlayStation and the Saturn. And it was like some different type of media that they used, which didn't do so well for them in the long run, considering the disk drive in the Dreamcast was very open to just reading burn games. But still, it shared similar technology. The visuals were better. The frame rate was definitely better than a lot of those titles, but it wasn't really comparable to things like the original Xbox, the GameCube, or even really the PS2. I mean, the PS2 played DVDs, and the original Xbox was basically a mini PC. And then things got even weirder when you go up to the 7th generation, mostly because of the way Nintendo handled that system with the Wii. Compared to the PS3 and the Xbox 360, it's not even close. I mean, the Wii is basically a slightly more advanced GameCube system. Seriously, there's a reason your GameCube disc worked right out of the box for the Wii. It's because that's basically what it was. I mean, really, they added some more RAM to it. They overclocked it a bit, but for the most part, Nintendo pivoted to what people were calling a gimmick at the time. That's the motion controls, which, well, turns out that gimmick worked very, 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 very well for them, and it ended up being the best-selling system that generation. And in fact, it was so successful that Microsoft and Sony took notice and tried doing their own motion control, controllerless gameplay, especially with the Kinect, which actually went on to do pretty well for Microsoft. I think that got to like 10 million units sold or something crazy, which makes more sense why they packaged the Kinect in for the Xbox One when they saw the success. Fortunately, it ended up being a massive mistake based on what Sony was able to do with the PlayStation 4. But the Wii is one that people look at a bit sideways, sitting next to the much more powerful and capable PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, which then brings us up to the 8th and 9th generations. The Wii U came out before the PS4 and the Xbox One, It wasn't as powerful as either of those systems, but it's still part of that same generation. And right around this time is when the generations that we basically had lined up well enough, minus the Dreamcast previously, started to get off schedule a bit. And yeah, that had to do with Nintendo trying to keep the Wii relevant as long as possible without introducing the Wii HD or something that had an HDMI port on it with like 1080p output or something. Basically, a Wii Pro to then get them a bit further, maybe into 2013, where they could have a different plan outside of the Wii U, because the Wii U did not do well for them, and they had to pivot very quickly away from it. I mean, there was like 2 or 3 years for the Wii U where nothing was coming out, and it turns out that, yeah, Nintendo seemed to be planning more for the Switch and even moved some games from the Wii U to that system. But the Wii U, there it is, with the PS4, the Xbox One, and the Switch. That's right, this generation for Nintendo potentially could last from 2012 until, like, who knows? I mean, Nintendo could go with the Switch currently. They say they're halfway through the generation, so they could run this thing to 2026. That'd be like a 14-year generation where they're releasing games into it. Well, hold on a second. Should the Switch be in the same generation with the Wii U? See, that's the big thing that people are debating, and it comes down, I guess, to the technology and how powerful the Switch is. Well, compared to the Wii U, it is more powerful, and it gets games that weren't possible on the Wii U. I mean, I don't believe Doom 2016 would have been able to run on the Wii U, or even Doom Eternal. The Switch has twice as much RAM, has a much newer architecture. In fact, if you look at the Switch compared to the Xbox One and the PlayStation 4, how they launched in 2013, it's on hardware that was released in 2015. Yes, it is technically newer hardware with that X1 chip than what the PlayStation 4 and Xbox One, at least base models, had inside. And I think the biggest thing now is that power gap with the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series systems compared to the Switch, that being why the current Switch as we know it is basically part of the 8th generation that started apparently in 2012. This is going to be a long generation for Nintendo, apparently now already being like 10 years old by the end of 2022. And it is tough because I can see it both ways here. I can see why people would say, well, it's nowhere near as powerful as the Xbox Series, the PlayStation 5. There are third-party games that are just missing the Switch because budget constraints, or the game's not running up to how they would like it to, or their inability to port it to ARM at that time. So it can't be next to the Series or the PS5. But then on the other side, I mean, it released in 2017 and it's on store shelves alongside of the Xbox Series and the PlayStation 5, whereas the Wii U is just completely discontinued. And things could get even stranger with this concept if, say, Nintendo opts to do a revision of the Switch and maybe has upscaling through DLSS, as is starting to really make the rounds right now after that NVIDIA leak, and they do have a Switch 4K. Well, then where's the Switch? Because all of a sudden, it's not this grainy picture necessarily, or them trying to stretch 720p to your big screen or any of that. It could very well end up being a 4K system that still falls in line with that Switch generation, which to me, sure, it probably wouldn't be as powerful as a Series X or a PS5, but could be maybe as capable just from the help of upscaling to where you could have a cleaner picture than what we have now with the Switch. And then if they're all doing 4K and potentially getting similar or close to the same third-party titles with that newer Switch revision, what's really the difference then? I mean, if you just line everything up, yes, technically the Switch is Nintendo's next generation system after the Wii U. In fact, it vastly improved on the Wii U's concept of becoming a portable system that can also accommodate your entire living room setup with that dock. So I'm kind of leaning to the side of the Switch actually being part of the 9th generation, especially if Nintendo wants to run this thing for another 5 years. You would expect them to have some sort of other system in line, maybe that does get them to that 5 or even 6 year mark starting from now. And yeah, that might be a Switch revision, a 4K system. Who knows what they call it? But I do wonder if Nintendo is looking to extend this to the point where we might get to the end of the Xbox Series and the PS5 generation, and we can have this conversation all over again with the PlayStation 6 and whatever Microsoft calls their next Xbox, as Nintendo had launched like 2 years prior or something. But let me know what you guys think about this, because that's what I'm really curious about. Where does everyone fall with this whole thing? I ran a poll at one point, and that was like very close to being like 50-50 split as well. So interesting conversation here, and yeah, a debate that will probably continue to rage on for years now. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you next time.